Okay, so a very warm welcome to Sean Lindley, who is a social scientist at Microsoft Research Cambridge. She's working at the intersection of future of work and machine intelligence. And with her team, they do lots of amazing things like delivering products, working on envisionments, prototypes, and user insights. She also works in AI collaboration in the context of showing enterprise knowledge application. But also being that her specific focus, she's also worked on digital possession. You may have seen her famous TED Talk and with wearable devices. She has a PhD in psychology from the University of York and a Master of Science in Human-Centered Computing System from the University of Sussex. And she was also a lecturer at the UCL before joining Microsoft. A very warm welcome from us. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the intro and thanks for joining everyone. I'm just going to try and share my screen, so hopefully this will work and you will be able to see what I'm looking at. Okay. Okay. So today I want to talk about how innovations in machine learning are changing the way organizations can build what we might call knowledge bases or knowledge repositories. So these are tools that support organizational memory. And they might be understood as something like an enterprise library or an enterprise wiki. And in particular, I'll focus on how these systems can be created by mining information that's produced by organization members. I'm going to suggest that these innovations create a need for new ways of understanding people, also supporting people in understanding how the actions they take as part of work impact machine learning, and through that may additionally impact their colleagues. And I'm going to highlight three challenges in this space, which are visibility, temporality, and overload. I'll begin by saying a bit about what I mean by machine-led knowledge bases and implicit interactions before talking about research into the different types of actions that people take as part of their work and the considerations for design that they raise. So hopefully, yeah, here we go. So first off, what a machine learned knowledge base is? Well, within the field of human-computer interaction, there's been a long-standing effort to create technologies that support organizational memory and sharing. And there are well-recognized problems in this space in that the knowledge that's generated as part of work often gets bound up with people's social networks or communities of practice, such that it's difficult to find answers to questions if you don't know who to ask, or if you don't have awareness of what's going on outside of your immediate team or peer group. And this can lead to people reinventing the wheel or duplicating prior work or just failing to build on it. And this isn't just an issue in research organizations, so sales organizations may find it difficult to know who else is working with the same customer. Service providers can find it difficult to keep a track of information about the resources they use. And this is especially problematic if things get fragmented across different systems. So it's recognized that there's a need to be able to create cohesive and up-to-date knowledge bases to sort of help organizations just work well. And systems that have been created to tackle these issues range from repositories of FAQs to tools that connect people with other organization members that might be considered experts or in other ways knowledgeable. So more recently, innovations in machine learning are enabling knowledge bases to be generated automatically from the content produced within large organizations. And the content these systems mine and curate is then presented back to organization members through the software applications that they commonly use. So to give an example, Microsoft Viva Topics is a fairly recently launched product that uses machine learning to recognize common topics within an organization. Then it creates what are called topic pages and topic cards about those topics. And those include descriptions of the topic, related people, and relevant resources. And you can see an example on your screen, on whatever screen you're looking at. So here in this example, we have a vehicle called Saturn, which is being produced by an organization. So you can see that there's a little topic card which has popped up. The text behind is a sort of SharePoint page. And you can see there's a slight gray highlight on the word Saturn. So if you hover over that highlight, you can see this topic card, which tells you a bit more about the topic. So in this case, yeah, so you've got the name description, and then you've got people who are working on it, resources that have been produced in relation to it, and so on. These topics can also be searched from within the context of work. So for instance, if you're in Word, you could search for one of these topics and you would receive information, relevant resources, and so on in the search pane. And the advantage of using machine learning here is that there's a much lower barrier to entry, obviously, if people aren't required to upload content to these systems and to curate it. So humans do play a role in curating and publishing topics within Viva Topics, but AI kickstarts that process for them. And of course, AI can also then play a role in recommending relevant content to users as they work. So, okay, so the next thing to address, I guess, is what do I mean by implicit interactions? So implicit interactions have been defined in various ways in the HCI literature, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to use this framework developed by Wendy Dew and Larry Lafer. And they identify implicit interactions as those that are taken proactively by a system or without the user's awareness. So for instance, when it filters your email, you could imagine that that is an example of an implicit interaction. They position this as a kind of sliding scale, so interactions can be more or less implicit, but the most implicit interactions occur in the bottom right quadrant of the framework, where the system is working proactively and in the background. And of course, knowledge bases that mine content and organize it are an example of an implicit interaction between the user and the system. So the system takes the initiative to add the content to the knowledge base, and that interaction happens in the background. Now, of course, users can be notified of this, and indeed some form of notification seems essential, as knowledge bases built by machine learning have the potential, I think, to introduce quite radical shifts in the ways in which knowledge is generated, shared, and consumed within workplaces. And that could in turn affect the ways in which organization members either contribute to or are seen to contribute to their organizations. So, as I've already mentioned, implicit interactions expand the ways in which people can contribute to organizational memory systems. So while traditional systems require people to explicitly upload documents or perhaps videos or talks or meetings like this one into a shared repository, systems that utilize implicit interactions could do all of these things for the user. Furthermore, they may in the future have the potential to learn about other aspects of work. For instance, they may draw inferences from processes that are followed. They may learn from the choices that users make. For instance, if they select some pieces of content over others as part of an interaction with a search pane, or they may draw inferences from the networks that people form to get work done. Okay. And so this brings us back to the question of action, really, and how people understand how the actions that they take then impact those knowledge bases. So for instance, the actions that I take to produce a presentation like this could result in that presentation itself being mined and added to a repository or to an intranet site, and then highlighted in the form of a recommendation to some other person in my organization. And while those recommendations would preserve the permissions of the original content, the fact that content is surfaced in a new context, or maybe over a longer period of time than I might have envisaged, needs to be considered in design. And additionally, it's possible that future systems could learn something from the steps I take to prepare the presentation. So for instance, maybe presentations that are well received within an organization are shared with colleagues beforehand, or follow a particular style, or turned into a video, or whatever it might be for that particular organization. So AI might be able to generate recommendations based on inferences drawn from the actions that are taken in the production of knowledge, as well as the actual outputs. So given the potential for systems to learn through both content and action, we researched the sorts of actions organization members take in getting work done. And with my colleague Denise Wilkins, we've done diary studies and workshops to ask what sorts of actions people take to get work done, what can be learned from those using machine learning, how they can be supported via machine learning, and what other considerations for design are raised. So in this work, we focused on what we call collaborative actions through a diary study. And by this, I simply mean the actions people take in relation to other people as part of work. And we've also focused on knowledge actions. And these are the type through workshops. These are some photos of the workshops. And knowledge actions are the kinds of actions people take when they're actually trying to produce some piece of knowledge. So for instance, we're looking at action rather than goal here. So while the goal might be to produce a presentation, lower level actions that feed into that might be searching for content or images, asking other people to contribute content, organizing meetings with people to discuss the content or maybe get it signed off, and then following up after it's been presented by sending emails to agree next steps or ask questions or whatever the process might be for the organization. So we built a framework of actions based on this work, but today I just want to focus on two categories that we looked at, and these relate to the production of knowledge and also to what's been called articulation work or the coordination of work. So producing knowledge is obviously a core component of knowledge work, the type of work probably most people on this call do. And actions that are bound up with the production of knowledge include things like generating data, so perhaps experimenting, observing or collecting feedback, gathering information, whether that's from online repositories or seeking it from other people, and then synthesizing that. So whether that means bringing it together to juxtapose or triage it, or to review it to see if more needs to be collected or if the goal has been reached, and producing knowledge through that process. In contrast, actions that are bound up with articulation work are slightly different. So articulation work has been defined as the work to make work work. And this is essentially the type of thing that probably everyone does that has to work with other people or coordinate their work in some way. So knowledge workers, but also managers, admin, frontline workers, etc. And it includes things like organizing logistics, so developing plans, preparing for work, determining who is going to do what, aligning directions, so making sure that everyone is working towards the same goal and potentially aligning that over time. And then coordination work, so things like tracking activity, updating others on what's going on, and otherwise maintaining awareness. So we then drew out these types of action in relation to the implicit and explicit interactions people have with knowledge bases, and particularly thinking about how they might contribute to that knowledge base. And this helped us then think about opportunities and considerations for design. So for instance, when workers are focused on producing knowledge as part of their work in the form of a deliverable, like a document or a presentation, they can choose to explicitly add that to a knowledge base, or machine learning might do that implicitly for them. Additionally, those systems could potentially in the future draw inferences from the actions that users take. So for instance, if users as part of this process are looking for information and select some over others, those inferences could be drawn about content quality, which could then impact the recommendations that are made to future users. So a knowledge base that learns from efforts to produce knowledge could obviously incorporate the results of that process, the knowledge that's produced into a knowledge base. So that might mean that they could help organization members either find that knowledge or the people who helped to generate it, and potentially also enable reuse of it. But it also highlights a number of considerations for design as well. So these include how people can be made aware that they're contributing knowledge to a knowledge base if that's done implicitly. And this is especially important where there may be a risk of oversharing or misinterpretation by others. These questions become more complex again if intelligent systems begin to kind of combine material or configure content out of multiple pieces of source material and present it in a different way. So then that kind of raises questions about how you begin to, if you want to remove content from a knowledge base, how do you do that if it's been combined with other pieces? How do you communicate the context of those pieces if they've been brought together? Or how do you acknowledge who has authored that content? Or potentially, if you need to determine accountability, how would you do that? And then there's a risk also that if systems begin to make recommendations, that those will introduce or reflect filter bubbles and affect people within an organization's opportunities to have impact. And this is especially important if these systems become bound up with any kind of analytics that are associated with performance, for instance. So if we ask the same question in relation to articulation work, we can consider how the work that makes work work could result in implicit or explicit contributions to machine learned systems. So for instance, organization members could explicitly upload something like a project plan to a knowledge base, or the system could, of course, do that for them implicitly. It could also look at tools like Trello or Slack for things like deadlines or actions and mine content from those systems too. And finally, there's a possibility that details could be inferred from the actions of team members. So for instance, you could imagine models being built about project roles or timelines and used to create a knowledge base. And again, this raises both opportunities and considerations for design. So it's possible that in the future, intelligent systems could generate suggestions to support project setup, or could help update and alert team members regarding the use of shared resources or the status of agreed actions. And actually this is kind of something that came up in the research, that centralizing planning, keeping records up to date were things that people struggled with. So it feels possible that a knowledge base could really help here. And looking ahead, such systems might even be able to recommend actions or next possible steps based on inferences of working process. But again, this obviously raises considerations. So considerations include the additional complexity of how you make people aware that procedural knowledge has been mined. So I feel like when content is implicitly contributed to a knowledge base, at least organization members have something to fall back on, that they understand that they've shared a document, that it's got a certain set of permissions associated with it, and that that's now just being made visible in a different place, but the permissions are the same, the content is the same. When you're contributing some aspect of working process, that becomes a lot more complex, I think, to communicate to users. There's not an existing mental model in the same way. It also raises questions around things like audience. So it's obviously not clear at all who the audience for a process should be, or if workers feel more possessive over knowledge about the ways in which they work rather than the content that they produce. They might feel that that's something that's more kind of intrinsically bound up with them than they would about a document that they've delivered to their manager, for instance. So these are all questions, I think, for further research. A second consideration relates to how design can acknowledge the ambiguity and flexibility that working processes need. So we know that plans are rarely exact. They're often used as resources to guide action rather than something which is followed in a very concrete way. And that needs to be accounted for in systems too. And finally, there's a risk potentially to agility and innovation if processes are replicated within organizations without people really innovating or reflecting on those in their work. Okay, so we found this framework to be a useful tool in thinking through how people can contribute to knowledge bases via explicit and implicit interactions, whether that's by mining content or by drawing inferences from the actions people take as part of work. An additional observation I wanted to offer was that this distinction between content and action is also helpful in considering how we can direct a user's attention to the implicit interactions they may have with a system. So that's the thing that I want to close with now. So I feel like a useful way of thinking about implicit interactions with content and through action is to use the metaphor of a mediator. This has been used in HCI in relation to explicit interactions people have when using tools. So for instance, in activity theoretical HCI, tools are conceptualized as mediators that are essentially invisible in use. So for instance, if a user is writing a document, their focus is primarily on the document itself, unless something goes wrong that draws their attention back to the word processor that they're using. So if it crashes or they can't figure out how to do something, they will focus on the tool, but otherwise they're focusing on the object. So the word processor is understood as a mediator. It mediates their interaction with a document. So when knowledge bases are created by mining organizational content, the objects that are created can also be understood as mediators. So we almost have like a second layer of mediation, but one that the user is unaware of unless they are alerted to it. And then finally, when intelligent systems are built on top of these to, for instance, recommend content to other organization members, we have a third layer, which is between the knowledge base and the other organization members. So obviously those other people are aware that something's being recommended to them, but the original author may not be aware of that interaction. So I think mediation is an interesting concept just because it offers a complement to other more familiar metaphors in this space. So human AI collaboration often looks to metaphors like a useful assistant or collaborating partner, something that's worked with. But I think in this sense, we have something that is worked through. You're working through the AI to kind of contribute to the knowledge base or to have impact on other organization members. And that's something that feels slightly different. And I think considering how mediators can be brought into view also brings us back to the challenges that I sort of briefly mentioned at the beginning of the talk, which were visibility, temporality, and overload. So visibility has, of course, been a constant theme in the considerations I've raised. And I think the notion of tools as mediators are useful in highlighting the challenges here. So we've discussed how even when users are explicitly interacting with something, the focus of their attention might be elsewhere. So if they're using the word processor, their attention may be on the document that they're creating. And I think when we begin to think about how people contribute to knowledge bases and how that might not only be through the content that they produce, but through the actions that they take, that then asks the question of how do you make people aware of what those actions are? How can they be helped in understanding what those sort of patterns of action are that they might be producing that might then be mined and potentially turned into recommendations or suggestions or whatever it might be. So relating to temporality, I think there's some interesting questions around how content in knowledge bases may have a different life cycle than that which was envisaged by their authors and how that relates to organizational memory. So research by Ida Larson-Ledette has shown that documents play various roles and represent various things to users in collaborative work. So for instance, they represent some kind of future goal. You may have an idea of what this document is going to become, even if it's a long way from that right now. And of course, it also represents the current state of activity and helps coordinate work at that point in time. So in progress documents are obviously something that we all have many of, but there is likely to be mined by machine learning systems as things which are finished. And it's not clear how we might indicate the provisional status of those documents, or indeed how long any document should persist in a knowledge base, or at least be easily findable. And I think this kind of requires designers to weigh the benefits of organizational memory and organizational forgetting. So there's a question here in how users can be helped in understanding how systems persist their content over time and potentially continuing to service it in recommendations or suggestions, perhaps after a user has moved on to something else. And then this brings us really to the third point, which is about information overload. So obviously keeping everything can contribute to information overload, as can being connected with many other organization members through a knowledge base, or even being made fully aware of the impact you're having through that knowledge base. So users need to be helped in understanding what the outcomes of their contributions to a knowledge base are, but in a way that's manageable and not in itself burdensome. Oh, sorry, I thought I clicked. Okay, here we go. So just to conclude then, through the talk, I've tried to highlight some of the challenges in supporting organization members in understanding their implicit interactions with machine-learned knowledge bases. And I've particularly highlighted visibility, temporality, and overload as three that we're thinking about in more depth. I've also highlighted the metaphor of mediation as one that might offer a useful complement to partnership when designing for human AI collaboration. And I just want to finish by acknowledging my colleagues at Microsoft, and in particular Denise Wilkins, who's worked on me quite closely with this in this work, And for more details, we have a Alexandria project page, where you can see the publications that we've done in this area. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Shall I stop sharing so we can discuss, or what's the?
And actually, it might be useful if you, well, actually stop sharing in case if somebody wants to point to a slide, you get back to the slide.
Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to refine Zoom. The full Zoom, it's gone small.
Thank you so much. There were also physical claps here in the physical audience, even though you couldn't hear them probably. So it's a very inspiring talk. Feel free to write your questions down, or if you have questions for the people who are here, I'll try my best to repeat them on Zoom. And just to break the ice, I wanted to ask you a question about this balance that you mentioned between visibility and temporal validity of the information. And I was curious about, so one thing is, I would assume that different levels of information may be visible to different people and different roles in the company, mainly for privacy reasons, I guess. But also you mentioned the filter bubbles. So I was wondering if in your Viva topics technologies, you're also considering ways to expose users to new content that may not necessarily be relevant from an algorithmic point of view to them, but may expose them to new content, and what are the privacy implications of that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So, so topics doesn't do anything to privacy. So the permissions that you would set would be kind of maintained. So it just kind of, it makes things visible to the people who can already see them, but in potentially different contexts. Obviously, that might be a wide audience, so people can quite often make the permissions visible to everyone in their organization, and that's quite often an option when you're choosing your permissions. So there is scope for things to be surfaced up to people who might not otherwise see them. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking about in relation to that is that often, like in thinking about organizational knowledge, we think about, you have like the things that you know you don't know, but then you have the things that you don't know that you don't know, and there's the unknown unknowns, they're called, and I think there's something really interesting in how you could maybe begin to use systems to try and flag those things up, and that would kind of maybe get around the sort of, or be one way into at least broadening the kinds of things that people are exposed to, and potentially getting around filter bubbles. I think one of the issues with these systems is that if they begin to recommend content a lot and then people select that content and it kind of reinforces, that's when you have another risk of filter bubbles. So I think there's a question there about how you address that, how you make sure that people are kind of fairly represented within these systems, how, that there's a kind of equitable opportunity to be seen through these systems, because I think these systems have the potential to allow organization members to be seen in new ways. And that has to be kind of designed in. So yeah, I think there's some interesting opportunities in that space.
No, that's super interesting. It would be super cool to see a system that can unleash the unknown unknowns from a system as well. That would be very interesting. Does anyone either here or on Zoom have any questions?
Yeah, I'll ask the next question.
Yes.
So yeah, so thank you very much again. I mean, these this project is so big, and it touches pretty much every single issue from the technical aspects of knowledge representation to organizational systems and HCI. So there are so many questions one can ask. So I have quite a few. I will ask one, and then we take it from there. So I guess a typical problem with systems that learn your behavior is the fact that in a sense you are happy if the system does the right thing without you having to do anything. but at the same time, you want to know in advance what the system will learn. So, like the classic example is the smart thermostat. I basically essentially switched off all the smart features in my smart thermostat at home because it kept learning things that I didn't want to learn about my behavior. I want to decide when the heating is on. Please don't decide on my behalf. If I go shopping for 5 minutes, I don't want the system to make too many inferences. So I guess I think your various dimensions. You have these dimensions, implicit versus explicit, control, proactive versus reactive. So what essentially, what would be your advice to people who build smart thermostat, or people who want to try to address the tension between the implicit learning versus providing the user with enough control of what the system learns?
Yeah, I think I guess there's a couple of things. There's a couple of ways of looking at it. So one is kind of supporting people's understanding of what those implicit interactions are so that they can then change their behavior accordingly. So there's quite a nice, so Alan Dix also wrote a paper about incidental interactions, which is essentially the same kind of thing. And he kind of made this he lays out this kind of transition from incidental to expected to intended. So at first, you're using these systems and things happen, and then you kind of know that they're going to happen. And then you can maybe change your behavior to intend them to happen. And I think especially in terms of like systems like knowledge bases, where you're essentially, you could use them as a way of disseminating content to your organization. That's kind of, I think, how you want people to begin to start thinking about them. That you want them to get to the point where they understand, okay, so if I store my content in this particular place, or if I share it in this particular way, or if I do take these particular steps, then I'm going to contribute to this system, and that's something that I want to happen. And also they might learn that if I don't want stuff in there, I can store it on my desktop, or whatever it is, or maybe I've got a folder that is somehow hidden from the system, or whatever it is, to give them those sorts of agency. I think the other thing, which is kind of interesting, which you were maybe pointing to, is that sometimes it's useful to give users a much more explicit way of teaching the system. And so some of my colleagues at Microsoft are looking at few shot learning, and it's more in relation to actually sort of assistive technologies for people who are blind or visually impaired, and enabling them to train systems just by saying, okay, I want you to be able to tell me where this is, or I want to teach you about how something works, and I'm going to give you a few shots to do it, and doing it very explicitly. But I think there's something really interesting there, where sometimes you have this experience where you feel like the system just can't learn from you, and you just want to be able to teach it something. Like when I'm driving home, my Maps app always wants to send me in a particular way, which is a really silly way to go, and I would never go there. And like if I could say, okay, follow me this time, this is the way that I want to go, then I would feel like I would have taught it something. So I wonder if there are kind of opportunity, like if there's an interesting way of kind of balancing things and enabling people to have maybe more explicit sort of teaching moments with the system, where they say, okay, I want you to learn this. This is the thing that I want you to learn, and I'm going to do it like 5 times or whatever it is, and then you will have learned it. So I think there's something maybe interesting in that space, but
yeah, I mean, this is a great point. In fact, Maps is a good example, because it's one of the most frustrating technology. It's both ubiquitous, but also it's incredibly frustrating. It's you have no mechanism to tell a map, look, that's what I want to do, and unless there is a catastrophe, like the road is completely blocked or whatever, allow me to do. The Maps is good. Okay, let's hear from the audience. Any question from the audience? This is, today is a little bit quieter audience than usual. Come on, don't be shy.
Alessio had a question.
Hello, calling from KMI. Thanks for the presentation. I got a question about what's your opinion about how do you manage the knowledge about formal processes, formal protocols, and informal practices, because I think that what you're describing has the risk, and actually maybe that's what we want, to uncover the work that makes the work work, which is not the kind of work that organization want to happen on a specific way. How do you blend them? And these are, I think, very specific challenges.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So I think, like you say, there's often sort of formal processes which might be codified in, you know, standard operating procedures or documents, and then there's, okay, sorry, I thought you'd all frozen for a minute. And then there's the ways in which people actually get work done. And yeah, I think I sort of mentioned briefly that often plans are used by, you know, like Lucy Suchman's obviously written about this in depth, but plans are often taken as kind of flexible resources. They're drawn on in practice, but obviously they need to be adapted to the particular situation, the particular context. Workers kind of reflexively adapt those plans, and they learn through the ways that they adapt those plans, and it's a kind of ongoing process. So I think one concept I find really quite inspiring in this space is Wanda Olakowski also talks about useful practice rather than best practice, and she talks about how you have this idea of best practice and then you have useful practices, which are the things that people actually develop and use as part of their work. So yeah, I absolutely agree that if systems were to be able to infer any aspect of working process, there's a question about how that's then presented back to users so that they're not prescribed. Basically, they can't be taken as kind of a prescriptive set of steps, but they need to be presented more in a kind of as a resource that can be drawn on, as, you know, suggestions or things that you might be able to use, but things which are sort of there for the taking rather than sort of positioned as strong recommendations or things in which you should do. I think there's another risk where, well, there seems to be a possibility that you might have a more kind of a situation where, you know, the ways of working are seen to kind of contradict organizational policy. I don't know what would happen then. Like, what would it mean if machine learning systems began to uncover working processes that were odds with some kind of thing which was actually required? There's a risk there too, I think. Yeah, I don't know what happens then, but I think that's something that designers of systems that would begin to infer action and try and develop workflows would need to think about.
Yeah, I was thinking, thinking about what you said about having more explicit way to interact with the machine learning algorithms, and also how sometimes we cannot predict as much what's going to come out of it. And I was thinking in terms of the type of knowledge that you can extract through machine learning, because I guess all the implicit knowledge that you mentioned, we may informally call it know-how. And I would assume that machine learning is very good at extracting more know-what or factual knowledge. So what is your perception about the ability of this system to go more towards extracting implicit knowledge? And more specifically, like, do you think there is another step that can be done from there, moving more towards common sense? And you think common sense knowledge may be of help in the enterprise?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, certainly Viva Topics is focused on know what, really. So it's really all about kind of you know, documents, things which can be articulated, and things which have been articulated in documents or other kind of forms of text, really, is what that system does now. Obviously, it looks at things like, you know, recommending people. So I think it's a question for future research if we can begin to build processes and know-how around these sorts of around, you know, the kinds of organizational knowledge that are produced. And yeah, I don't know. It's a question for future research, and I think common sense is a further step again. So yeah, it's something that we're interested in, but it's something that's definitely would be further along in the future.
Okay, I'll ask the next question, which again, I mean, is one of the issues concerning this research that you mentioned. That is, of course, you know, there is a famous, you know, saying, knowledge is power, and you know, a lot of research in knowledge management and, you know, organizational knowledge has faced this problem that there are a number of elements. You know, there are some elements that sometimes people don't, you know, funny enough, don't particularly want to share knowledge that makes you know, the role unique in an organization. So there is the issue of incentives. You know, what are the incentives, you know, for people to share knowledge? But also the other thing is that not everybody is allowed necessarily to have access to the same knowledge. So you know, there is the issue of privacy and control of access. In fact, I can tell you that many years ago, I think it was still in the 90s, we had the project with a very big multinational company, which was not Microsoft, I can say, and basically they asked us to build such a knowledge management, you know, knowledge sharing support system for them, which was shut down after 6 months because it was working too well. You know, it turns out that the members of the organization were sharing too much knowledge about the organization, particularly, you know, in a bigger distributed organization, you know, with people, some people in New Zealand, some people in Canada, some people in the States, etc. And the management felt threatened by this flow. You know, this was before Facebook and before social media, etc. So they shut it down. You know, so it wasn't working too well. So basically, yeah, my question is, you know, if your project really succeeds, how can you make sure that the Microsoft management won't shut it down? You know, so how do you deal with the control of who has access to knowledge, ownership, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I guess it makes me think of two things. And one is that the kind of questions around privacy and permissioning and how aware people are of the ways in which they're sharing, and how they can kind of have control over that. And that's really a question about helping people set permissions in a way that they understand what they're doing, which is not as straightforward as it sounds, I think. And the second is really, I think it kind of touches on this idea of organizational boundaries, and one of the goals of our project really is to kind of create a single unified knowledge base that kind of works across organizational silos. But I think we also have to be very aware that organizational boundaries do have a role to play in organizations, and, you know, sharing across boundaries can kind of raise the sorts of issues that you raised, or can just be it's very difficult to share across organizational boundaries because people have different ways of thinking and seeing, and the kind of context that goes around a piece of information that's produced in one place may not necessarily translate to somewhere else. So the work of kind of having to recontextualize content when it's being kind of interpreted across an organizational boundary can be quite significant and can lead to kind of misunderstandings. So yeah, I think there's a question there about how you can sort of support work across organizational boundaries. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right about the kind of idea of knowledge as power, and how some people might be more protective around the stuff they produce and want to kind of keep it close. And I think really that it comes down to a question of how people can be made to feel in control of when systems could be adding content, you know, to a knowledge base in the background. And so I think there's a question about how you alert people, when you alert people. You know, you might not be wanting to alert people all the time when this is happening, but what are the kind of questions around timeliness, or what are the things which can be put in place so that people understand what's happening, and how is that designed? And I think that's part of that too. It's kind of enabling that sense of agency, when these systems are, well, you kind of don't want to overwhelm people with notifications and so on, but you also want to kind of make them feel in control. And it's that sort of tension between the two, which I think needs to be addressed there.
Just quick follow-up. So is there a kind of departmental scope in the Microsoft Viva topics? Is he?
No, I don't think so. Not right now. So I think I don't think so. I think it will look at the permissions around content, but it doesn't look at things like departments, for instance.
Okay, so in theory, it's accessible to any Microsoft employee.
Yeah, if you've got the permissions to see the content, then you would be able to see it. Yeah.
Okay, I think Alessio, do you have another question? Yep, you go ahead.
Yes. I want to take actually your point from the opposite point of view. I think we are a little bit biased because we work in a university, so everybody supposedly produce content. But I was reading a very interesting book from a paleographer said that there are few activities in human life that actually create a disparity between people as writing. And with large organization, the production of content is something usually related to few people that can and will and produce most of the content for everybody else. So my question for you is what you think are the opportunities and the threats for such a system to create a little bit of balance in representation of the different parts of bodies in a community? And what are the risk of, I don't know, maybe amplifying differences? For instance, we know that maybe as human, we are a little bit more sensitive to the quality of writing. Maybe machine learning is not, so can get the treasure hidden behind the form or something like that.
I guess one thing that this makes me think of is language. So like, Microsoft is a huge organization, and we have companies, branches in different parts of the world, and also who are writing in different languages. So I think language is a kind of interesting barrier which could potentially be addressed by systems like this, where you could begin to kind of bubble up content that's related to the same. It can be kind of unified in the knowledge base, but that it's been produced in different languages and could potentially be translated. So I think there are kind of interesting barriers where, it's a company which obviously is quite heavily English speaking. We have an American headquarters. But if you're maybe working in a different part of the world, there are kind of interesting questions about how visible the work that you produce might be within the broader organization. So I think there's some kind of interesting possibilities for ML systems in bringing that type of, being a bit more equitable in terms of like dealing with content that's produced in different languages and kind of joining it in ways that would be very difficult for humans to do, for instance. So that's one possibility.
Okay, I think I guess it's probably time to wrap up. I think we went beyond the normal 45-minute slot. Unless there is any burning question from anybody, I'll say let's wrap up. Agnes, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Sean. Let's give another round for this excellent presentation, and thank you all for participating either remotely or in person. And yes, we'll take a little some hiatus or break, and then we'll see you again within the month in the autumn.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So Agnes, Sean, if you stay online for a few more minutes, we allow everybody else to leave.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.